the mainstream media, and he has in particular the New York Times and CNN in mind, are prejudiced against him, which I think would probably be true, but publish fake news, which I think is far less plausible. So I think that the attack on the mainstream media is just a reenactment of the Nixon presidency. Richard Nixon used to say exactly the same things about the New York Times and the Washington Post. The new thing is the attack on social media, which of course Richard Nixon didn't have to contend with. Now, a year ago, if you went to Washington and said to Republicans, you know you have a problem with Silicon Valley, don't you? They would have looked at you as if you were mad, because after all, Silicon Valley had helped Trump to victory, even if it was inadvertently. He's the master of Twitter. His campaign through Steve Bannon knew how to use Facebook advertising much better than Hillary Clinton's did. But now it's dawned on people in Washington, including the president, that Silicon Valley is never going to let 2016 happen again. And there is clearly quite a change of mood at Facebook, at Google, on the question of how far they should curate the content on their platforms. A few years ago, there was a libertarian view. You just put up anything, and terrorism was off, and paedophilia was off, but everything else you should basically allow. But that's changed.
The president's tweets themselves, and as you say, there's never been a politician in the history of mankind who's, well, of course, social media is very young, but who's used that medium or such a current medium so well, is there? I mean, obviously, I think of oratory throughout Hitler and Goebbels and Churchill, and people used oratory very, very well, but use of Twitter by Trump was masterful, wasn't it?
Well, I think it's a mistake to draw parallels with the dictators of the 1930s. I really wish people wouldn't do that.
Wasn't the dictator.
But the 1930s and 1940s aren't really relevant here, because the technology is so different. We now have a far more decentralized form of media, which is social media, with no editorial control. The question is whether companies like Facebook and Google are beginning to exert editorial control, tweaking algorithms so that, for example, alt-right, far-right content becomes less visible. That's clearly going on. We can see it in the way that Google search works. We can see the way in which certain content on YouTube gets demonetized if it's deemed to be extreme. The community standards of these companies have become more and more complicated. That began after Charlottesville, if not earlier. And so there has been a gradual shift in attitude in Silicon Valley, away from the libertarian let anything go mood of, say, 10 years ago, to a view that really there's a lot of hate speech that shouldn't be on the internet, and it's the job of Facebook and it's the job of Google to restrict it.
So now, becoming more mainstream and hence more editorial control.
Well, I don't think it's as simple as that, because remember, the volume of content is so vast on these platforms. They can't really edit it all, but what they are doing, I think, is beginning to take a somewhat more interventionist stance against far-right content. And who decides what is alt-right? Who decides what is hate speech? That's the big question, and it hasn't really been resolved in the United States, because in effect there's almost no regulatory constraint on what Facebook does, other than what Mark Zuckerberg decides to do to regulate himself.
Is that coming down now? Of course, we've seen social media stocks coming off every time the president tweets about them as well, and of course there's testimonies going on at the moment as well. Is that coming down the pipe? Is heavy regulation coming down?
Absolutely. My most recent book, The Square and the Tower, predicted a collision between Trump and Silicon Valley. They'd inadvertently helped him into power, but this was going to end very badly, and sure enough, he has ramped it up in recent months. He's attacked Amazon, he has attacked Twitter, he's after Google. I think this is going to be one of the big stories of the year, as not only Trump but many Republicans begin to ask themselves, are these companies too powerful and too liberal? It's just not quite clear what you do about their power. Do you use antitrust against them? That's been talked about. Do you regulate them as utilities? Steve Bannon talked about that last year. It's not clear, but I think something big is changing here, and it's going to become a huge political issue.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now, to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.